He is the most famous villain Shakespeare ever wrote. A hunchback. A murderer. A man who killed his brother, seduced his sister-in-law over her husband's corpse, smothered 2 innocent children in the Tower of London, and schemed his way to the English throne on a river of blood. Every schoolchild in the English-speaking world has read about him. Every production of his play is packed. Every Halloween, somewhere in the world, an actor limps onto a stage and snarls, "Now is the winter of our discontent." There is just one problem. Almost none of it is true. In August of 1485, King Richard III of England was cut down at the Battle of Bosworth Field. He was the last English king to die in combat. His crown was picked out of a thorn bush and placed on the head of the man who killed him. That man was Henry Tudor, and the dynasty he founded would rule England for the next 118 years. The Tudors had a problem. Henry's claim to the throne was weak. Laughably weak. So weak that if Richard III had been remembered as a decent king, half the country would have reasonably asked why Henry was even wearing the crown. The solution was obvious. Make Richard a monster. And not just a monster, the greatest monster in English history. Over the next 100 years, a parade of Tudor-employed historians, propagandists, and eventually a playwright named William Shakespeare built the myth. A hunchback with a withered arm. A child killer. A serial murderer of his own family. It was so well constructed that for 5 centuries, people believed it. Then in 2012, archaeologists dug up Richard's skeleton from under a parking lot in Leicester. And what they found didn't just complicate the story. It demolished it. Today we're going to walk through the 6 crimes Shakespeare pinned on Richard III, and show you how, one by one, modern historians have taken them apart. We're going to look at the skeleton itself. We're going to meet the Tudor propagandists who wrote the first drafts. And by the end, you'll understand why a growing consensus now holds that the most famous villain in English literature was, in large part, a frame-up. This is the real story of Richard III. To understand what happened to Richard III, you have to understand the man who replaced him. Henry Tudor was a Welsh-born exile with a claim to the English throne so tangled it took contemporaries entire afternoons to explain. His mother was descended from a bastard line that had been legally barred from the succession by an Act of Parliament. His father wasn't royal at all. When he landed on English soil in 1485 with a small army of French mercenaries and Welsh volunteers, he was, by any honest measure, a usurper. 3 weeks later, thanks to a battlefield betrayal, he was king. And now he had a problem that every usurper in history has faced. How do you convince a country that overthrowing the previous king was not just legal, not just legitimate, but righteous? How do you make people believe that God himself put you on the throne? You do it by making the previous king into a demon. Historians call this the Tudor myth, a deliberate, decades-long political project to rewrite the 15th century as a dark age of chaos from which the Tudors, heroically, had rescued England. Henry VII commissioned the official history. His son Henry VIII expanded it. His granddaughter Elizabeth I, writing patronage checks to the playwrights of her court, made sure it stayed in the popular imagination. The first major Tudor account of Richard III's reign was written by Polydore Virgil, an Italian humanist on Henry VII's payroll. The second, even more influential, was written by Sir Thomas More. Yes, the same Thomas More who appears on your school syllabus as a saint. More was a child during Richard's reign. His primary source was Cardinal John Morton, a man who had personally fled England during Richard's rule and had every reason to paint him in the darkest possible colors. These were not neutral historians. These were, effectively, Tudor employees. And the Richard they described, the hunchback, the child murderer, the serial killer in a crown, is the Richard we inherited. For 500 years, the first and most visceral lie about Richard III was written into his body. Shakespeare called him rudely stampered, deformed, withered, hunchbacked, a poisonous bunchback toad. The implication was clear, and it was medieval. A twisted body reflected a twisted soul. An evil exterior for an evil interior. To an audience in 1593, this wasn't metaphor. It was a diagnosis. The problem is, nobody had ever seen Richard's body. He was buried hastily in a Leicester friary after Bosworth. The friary was demolished during the Reformation. Over the centuries, the grave was lost entirely. By the time Shakespeare wrote his play, more than a century after Richard's death, there was no one alive who had ever actually seen the king. Then in 2012, a team from the University of Leicester, working with the Richard III Society, started digging under a council parking lot where the old friary had once stood. Within days, they hit bone. DNA testing against a living descendant confirmed it. This was Richard III. And the skeleton told a radically different story than Shakespeare. Yes, his spine was curved. But it wasn't the dramatic kyphosis, the forward hunch, that the play describes. It was adolescent idiopathic scoliosis. A sideways curve. Modern researchers, using CT scans and 3D printed models of the vertebrae, determined the curve was between 70 and 90 degrees. Significant. But here's what the scientific paper in The Lancet actually says. With a well-cut coat and proper armor, the condition would have been almost invisible. His legs were symmetrical. There was no limp. His arms were completely normal. No withered arm at all. In other words, a contemporary who actually saw Richard in 1484 described him in very different terms than Shakespeare would 100 years later. The chronicler John Rouse, writing only 5 years after Richard's death, said the king had one shoulder slightly higher than the other. That's it. That matches the scoliosis perfectly. The limping, withered hunchback monster. That was invented. The Tudor propagandists took a minor asymmetry and inflated it into a physical deformity that proved Richard's evil soul. And for 500 years, it worked. Shakespeare's play pinned 6 major murders on Richard. Let's go through them, one at a time. First, Henry VI, the Lancastrian king deposed by Richard's brother Edward. In the play, Richard stabs him to death in the Tower. In reality, Henry died in the Tower in 1471, yes, and yes, he was probably murdered. But Richard was 18 years old, on campaign, and the man in charge of the Tower that night was Edward IV, Richard's brother. The order, if there was one, came from the king. Not from Richard. Second, Edward of Lancaster, killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Shakespeare has Richard personally stabbing him. There is no contemporary source that says Richard was involved. He died in the battle, or shortly afterward, in the general chaos. No named killer. Third, George, Duke of Clarence. Richard's own brother. Famously drowned in a barrel of wine in the Tower in 1478. Shakespeare makes Richard the mastermind. But the execution was ordered by Edward IV, and every contemporary source, including hostile ones, says Richard was devastated by his brother's death. He publicly blamed the Queen's faction for it. That's the opposite of the play. Fourth, Anne Neville, Richard's wife. Shakespeare implies Richard poisoned her to clear the way for a new marriage. The reality? She died of what modern doctors believe was tuberculosis. It's a completely natural death. There is no evidence of foul play of any kind. Richard was reportedly so grief-stricken that he was seen weeping in public, a genuinely unusual thing for a medieval king. That's 4 murders. All 4 innocent. 4 out of 6. And then we get to the last 2. Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York. The Princes in the Tower. 2 boys, ages 12 and 9. The sons of Edward IV. The legitimate heirs to the throne, until Richard declared them illegitimate and took the crown himself. They were last seen in the summer of 1483, in the Tower of London, and then they vanished. Shakespeare tells us Richard had them smothered in their beds. That is the single most damning accusation in the entire case against him. And here is the honest answer. We do not know. The disappearance of Edward V and his brother is one of the great unsolved mysteries of English history, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend I can solve it in a YouTube video. What I can tell you is this. The case against Richard, the case you learned in school, rests almost entirely on sources written after his death, by people employed by the man who killed him. Thomas More's famous account, the one that shaped everything afterward, was written 30 years after the fact, relied on a source who hated Richard, and was never actually finished or published by More himself. The contemporary evidence, written while Richard was still alive, is murkier. People noticed the princes had stopped appearing in public. Rumors swirled. Some rumors blamed Richard. Other rumors blamed the Duke of Buckingham, who had his own claim to the throne and was in a position to act. Still others suggested the boys had been smuggled out of England. And here's a detail that almost never makes it into the popular story. When Henry Tudor seized the throne in 1485, he had every motive in the world to produce the bodies of the princes and announce that Richard had killed them. It would have been the ultimate propaganda victory. He did not. No bodies were produced. No formal accusation was made during his reign. Instead, Henry repealed the law that had declared the princes illegitimate, quietly, without explanation, which had the effect of making them the rightful heirs again, and therefore a threat to Henry himself, if they were alive. In 1674, workmen at the Tower found the bones of 2 children buried under a staircase. These were later interred at Westminster Abbey as the princes. Modern examination has been limited. The bones have never been DNA tested. The Crown has refused permission for over half a century. And in 2023, a researcher named Philippa Langley, the same woman who led the project to find Richard's skeleton, published evidence she believes shows at least one of the princes survived into adulthood and appeared as a pretender to the throne during Henry VII's reign. That work is contested. But it tells you something about how open the question still is, 540 years later. So here's the honest verdict on the princes. Richard had means. He had motive. He had opportunity. So did at least 2 other major figures. The most famous accusation in English history rests on propaganda written by the winners. It might be true. It might not. We genuinely do not know. What we do know is this. Richard was convicted of their murder not by a court, not by evidence, but by a playwright, 100 years after his death. Here is the fact that should bother you the most. Almost everything the average person thinks they know about Richard III comes from a play. Written in the early 1590s. More than 100 years after Richard's death. By a man who had never read a neutral source about him, because no neutral sources existed. Shakespeare was not a historian. He was a working playwright under a Tudor queen, Elizabeth I, the granddaughter of the man who killed Richard at Bosworth. Elizabeth attended his plays. Her court funded his company. Writing a sympathetic play about the man her grandfather overthrew would have been not just bad art, but bad business. Possibly treasonous business. So Shakespeare did what every artist under royal patronage has always done. He gave the crown the story it wanted to hear. He took Thomas More's hostile, unfinished account. He took Polydore Virgil's official Tudor history. He telescoped 26 years of political complexity into a 2-hour drama with one clear villain. And he made that villain the most charismatic, witty, magnetic character he had ever written. That last part matters. Because Shakespeare's Richard isn't just evil, he's entertaining. He talks directly to the audience. He lets you in on his schemes. He makes you laugh. 500 years later, actors still line up to play him, because the role is an all-time great piece of writing. And that's the tragedy of the real Richard III. He wasn't destroyed by bad propaganda. He was destroyed by brilliant propaganda. The play is a masterpiece. It's also a lie. And because it's a masterpiece, it outlived every correction. Historians have been pointing out the inaccuracies since the 1600s. Sir George Buck wrote a defense of Richard in 1619. Horace Walpole wrote another in 1768. Caroline Halstead wrote a full historical rehabilitation in 1844. Paul Murray Kendall's landmark biography in 1956 convinced a generation of serious historians that Richard had been wronged. And yet, if you stop 10 people on the street today and ask them about Richard III, 9 of them will give you Shakespeare's version. A hunchback. A child killer. A monster. That's what great art does. Even when it's wrong. So if Richard wasn't the monster, who was he? He was king for 26 months. That's it. Less than 2.5 years. In that time, he passed a set of legal reforms that are genuinely impressive. He established the presumption of innocence in criminal cases. He reformed the bail system to protect people who hadn't yet been tried. He banned certain corrupt legal practices. He made it possible for ordinary English speakers, not just Latin literate clerks, to access court records, which was a quietly radical thing to do in the 15th century. He founded the College of Arms. He protected the rights of freehold tenants. In the north of England, where he had governed for his brother before becoming king, he was genuinely popular. So popular that the City of York's official records, in the days after Bosworth, include a line mourning that King Richard, late mercifully reigning upon us, was through great treason piteously slain and murdered. That's a contemporary source. Written by people who knew him. And it calls him merciful. Was he a saint? No, medieval kings weren't. He seized the throne from his nephew in a legally dubious maneuver, even if you accept the argument that the nephew was illegitimate. He executed Lord Hastings without a proper trial. He lived in a violent world and he was not above using its tools. But he was not the monster. He was a reasonably effective king, cut short by a lucky battle. whose story was then handed to his enemies to write. In March of 2015, 530 years after the Battle of Bosworth, Richard III was reburied in Leicester Cathedral with full royal honours. The ceremony was attended by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Benedict Cumberbatch, himself a distant cousin of Richard, read a poem. Thousands of people lined the streets to watch the cortege pass. It was the kind of funeral he never got in 1485. When Henry Tudor threw his body in an unmarked grave under a Leicester friary. The Richard III Society, founded specifically to rehabilitate his reputation, maintains that of the 6 major crimes Shakespeare pinned on him, he is certainly innocent of 4, and the other 2 are unproven. That's a careful, evidence-based position. It's not hero worship. It's not a claim that Richard was a good man. It's just a claim that the legend is bigger than the evidence. And when you look at the skeleton, look at the documents, look at the timeline, that claim holds up. He was a man with a curved spine who became king too fast, in a violent century, and lost a battle he should have won. His enemies took the crown and then took his story. They called him a hunchback. They called him a child killer. They called him the worst king England had ever had. And for 500 years, we believed them. Then we dug him up. And the bones didn't match the play. History is written by the winners. That's true. But sometimes, if you're patient, and the ground cooperates, the losers get a chance to speak. Not through words, those were taken away, but through bone, and DNA, and the stubborn fact that the earth keeps what was buried in it. Richard III lay under a parking lot for 527 years. When he came back up, he had one thing left to say. And what he said was, Shakespeare got it wrong. If this video made you rethink what you thought you knew, do me a favor and hit subscribe. I've got more videos like this one coming. People history got wrong, villains who turned out to be victims, legends that fall apart when you actually check the receipts. And next time, we're going to tackle the biggest unresolved question of all. Because if Richard didn't kill the princes in the tower, who did? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.